Have you ever been judged just because of your quiet appearance? Malik Graham, a soft-spoken 7th grader, always sitting in the far corner of the classroom, never once called on during any discussion. To the teacher, he was nearly invisible. To his classmates, he was simply the quiet one. Until one day, the teacher unexpectedly asked him to come forward and sit at the old piano in the classroom, a request that seemed harmless on the surface but carried a purpose no one could quite guess. No one knew that the moment Malik placed his hands on the keys would be the moment that made the entire class hold its breath and forced the teacher to reflect on herself. He didn't need to speak loudly. With just one piece of music, he made the whole world fall silent to listen. And that story begins right now. Under the pale morning sunlight of a new week, Malik Thompson, a 7th grade boy with contemplative eyes and neatly cropped curls, stepped into his classroom at Crestview Middle School. He chose a seat by the window where the light easily filtered through the faded beige curtains and illuminated the notebook he was scribbling in. Malik wasn't the kind of student who drew attention. He was quiet, calm, and often silently observed everything happening around him. In the classroom, no one really paid attention to Malik, not even Ms. Marjorie Blake, the language arts teacher who also happened to set the tone for the whole class. Ms. Blake was a veteran teacher, known for her strictness and a certain aloofness. For high-achieving, outspoken students, she often spared a warm glance. But with Malik, the student who never volunteered to speak, she seemed to not see him at all. Malik wasn't unintelligent. On the contrary, his grades were consistently solid. He studied hard, grasped concepts quickly, but had never stood out. Every time he raised his hand, Ms. Blake would glance over and choose another student. When Malik gave a correct answer, she would simply nod before moving on. But when he answered incorrectly, though it was rare, she would repeat the question, pressing deeper, as if to ensure everyone noticed the gap. Tyrese, a boy who sat next to him, once whispered, "You're like invisible to her, man." Malik only smiled and shrugged. He was used to it, used to being underestimated, used to living in a room full of people who never really saw him. However, there was one thing nearly no one in the class knew. Malik was the grandson of Arthur Thompson, a legendary jazz pianist who had performed across the southern United States. Malik grew up with music and spent countless quiet afternoons beside an old upright piano in a modest house on Waverly Street. His fingers had learned to tell stories through keys since he was just 5 years old. But Malik had never shown that side of himself at school. Music, to him, was sacred, a part of his private world, a realm he wasn't ready to share, especially not with people who had never truly acknowledged his presence. That morning, Ms. Blake entered the class holding a thick book in her hands and tapped it lightly on the desk to get everyone's attention. Her voice rang out evenly, deliberately. "We're going to start today's lesson with some new material, but before that..." She scanned the room. Then, unexpectedly, her gaze landed on Malik. "Malik, you can answer this question." The whole class turned to look at him. There were surprised expressions, even a few soft chuckles from the back of the room. This was the first time all semester that Ms. Blake had called his name. Malik paused slightly, then calmly responded. His answer was correct, concise, and accurate. But instead of nodding as she usually did, Ms. Blake merely glanced at him and said, "Acceptable." The class chuckled again. Malik lowered his head and resumed taking notes. But inside, something had shifted. Because sometimes, silence is no longer a choice, but a challenge. The dismissal bell rang, and the students immediately burst into chatter, hurriedly stuffing books into their backpacks. Malik slowly gathered his belongings, but just as he stood up, Ms. Blake's voice rang out from the teacher's desk. "Malik, stay for a moment." A few eyes turned toward him. Tyrese raised an eyebrow at him sympathetically, but Malik only nodded slightly. He was used to hearing less than kind remarks. He thought, "She's probably going to remind me about my study habits or something." The classroom gradually emptied. Malik walked up to the teacher's desk and stood silently, waiting. Ms. Blake didn't look up right away. She was writing something in her notebook, then suddenly spoke, her tone softer than usual, but still with a deliberate cadence. "I heard you talking the other day about your grandfather." Malik furrowed his brows slightly. "Yes? Your grandfather was a musician, wasn't he? A pianist?" Malik nodded slowly, not sure what this had to do with anything. "Jazz, right?" She squinted, as if trying to recall. "Yes, he played jazz. Performed in New Orleans, Memphis, even Little Rock." Ms. Blake sat up straight and folded her arms. A faint smile appeared on her lips, but there was something about it not entirely well-meaning. Then you must know how to play too? Malik hesitated, unsure if this was curiosity or sarcasm. Just a little, he replied. What do you mean by a little? She tilted her head. Can you play a piece? Malik didn't answer right away. He didn't like to show off, especially not to someone who had never believed in his abilities. I only play for fun, he said. Ms. Blake studied him closely, then gave a slight nod. Then tomorrow you'll play for the class, right after literature. Malik's eyes widened. Sorry, what? The piano in the corner, she said, pointing at the dusty old instrument near the window. It's been sitting there all semester and no one's touched it. If you have talent, show it. Share it with the class. Her words sounded like an invitation, but her eyes and her smile felt like a trap. Malik stood still, not because he was afraid, but because he could clearly sense this wasn't a genuine offer. This was a test, a veiled challenge dressed as an opportunity. When Ms. Blake saw that Malik didn't respond, she gave a faint smile. There's no need to be nervous. If you really know how to play, then there's nothing to worry about. Malik gave a small nod. Yes, ma'am. He turned and left the classroom, fully aware that her eyes were still watching him from behind. He didn't feel angry, only a quiet sensation, like the sound of an old piano echoing in a room where no one bothered to listen. As he walked down the empty hallway, Malik suddenly remembered the last afternoon he spent with his grandfather. His grandfather sat by the old piano, tapping the keys gently as he said, "People might judge you by what they see. But music, Malik, music is where you make them truly listen." Tomorrow he would make them listen, not because Ms. Blake asked him to, but because for the first time he wanted them to know. He wasn't just the quiet shadow by the window. The afternoon at home passed as quietly as a still lake. Malik arrived home, closed the gate, and walked straight into his room without turning on the light. He dropped onto the bed, tossed his backpack aside, and stared at the ceiling as if hoping to find an answer written up there. Inside him was a tangled mess of emotions, curiosity, nervousness, but above all, doubt. He knew exactly what Ms. Blake's true intention was. It wasn't encouragement. It was a challenge disguised as an opportunity, but in truth, it was an open trap. She wants me to play, so the whole class can laugh, Malik thought to himself, shaking his head gently. From the kitchen, his mother's voice called out, "Malik, you're home? I'm making braised chicken with taro." He answered softly, "Yes, Mom." A moment later, she walked in, still holding a dish towel. She saw the thoughtful look in her son's eyes and sat beside him, gently touching his shoulder. "Something happened at school?" she asked. Malik was silent for a moment, then began to explain. He told her about the conversation with Ms. Blake, about being asked to perform in front of the class, about the look in her eyes and the tone of her voice that made him feel unrespected. She listened without interrupting, only nodding softly and occasionally squeezing his hand to let him know he was being heard. "When I said Grandpa was a jazz musician, her eyes looked like she was preparing some kind of test," Malik said, lowering his eyes. "I'm not sure if she actually wants to hear my music, or just wants to prove I'm not good enough." Malik's mother sighed, then stood up and opened a drawer, taking out an old photograph, an aged black and white picture. His grandfather, Jeremiah, seated at an upright piano, eyes half closed, fingers gliding across the keys as if chasing a melody no one else could see. "Your grandfather used to say," she began gently, "when people don't believe in you, you don't need to prove it with words, let the music speak." Malik was silent. A small warmth stirred in his chest. His grandfather, the first music teacher he ever had, the one who taught him his very first blues notes, the one who told him, "Music is where you get to be yourself, even if the world only sees your name." He got up and walked toward the old keyboard in the corner of his room. The instrument had faded with age, a few keys slightly sunken, but the soul of it, the soul of his grandfather, remained intact. He sat down and let his fingers brush a few notes, melodies that seemed to awaken from a long sleep. His mother stood at the door, saying nothing, only smiling. She knew her quiet son was finding his courage. "Are you scared?" she asked softly. Malik nodded. "A little, but I also feel ready." "Then you really are ready," she smiled. "People are only strong when they dare to step forward, even while still afraid." That evening, Malik played for nearly an hour, alone in his room. He practiced the pieces his grandfather once taught him, feeling every keystroke like a conversation with the past. He no longer thought about Ms. Blake or the giggles in the classroom. He thought only of his grandfather and of the music. And when he finally lifted his hands after the last note, he knew. Tomorrow morning, He wouldn't play to impress anyone. He would play to affirm who he truly was. The next morning, Malik woke up earlier than usual. He sat by the window, watching sunlight filter through the tree branches, casting soft, fragile beams across the porch roof. His heart still beat steadily, but no longer carried the heaviness of the night before. He ate breakfast in silence, slung his backpack over his shoulder, and stepped out of the house. The walk to school felt longer today, not because of the distance, but because of the thoughts quietly lining up in his mind. As he entered the classroom, Malik immediately felt the eyes on him. Tyler signaled from across the room, his gaze a mix of surprise and scrutiny. Madison glanced at him, then quickly turned away. Even Brandon, the one who usually scoffed every time Malik spoke, looked at him with something unfamiliar. Nearly everyone had heard. "Hey Malik," a classmate behind him nudged. "You're playing piano today, right? Hope you play better than you write essays." Malik didn't answer. He placed his bag down, took out his notebook like every other day, and kept his eyes on the desk. But inside, he was prepared. Ms. Blake entered the classroom right on time as usual, long skirt, thin-rimmed glasses, lips pursed in her habitual expression. But today, something was different in the way she scanned the room like she was looking for someone. And then her gaze landed on Malik. "We're going to start class with something special today," she said, her tone even, but her gaze sharp. "Yesterday, a student shared that he has a talent for music, and I thought it would be lovely for the whole class to hear it." She paused, a faint, cool smile on her lips. "Malik, are you ready?" No one laughed, but no one breathed either. The entire class turned toward him, all eyes filled with anticipation. Some hoped for entertainment, others were simply curious. As for Ms. Blake, she didn't hide the challenge in her eyes, subtle amusement mingled with skepticism. She wasn't scolding, she wasn't harsh, but the way she chose her words, the way she called it something special, made it feel like Malik was just the morning's entertainment. Malik took a deep breath. "Yes," he replied, then stood up. The sound of the chair scraping echoed through the otherwise silent room. He walked toward the back of the class where the old, dusty piano stood. Beneath its dark-stained surface were scratches along the body witnesses to stories long untold. He sat down, gently brushed dust off the keys with his sleeve. A few students snickered. Someone whispered, "Don't mess up, Malik." But he didn't respond. Malik didn't look up. His hands rested lightly on the keys, cool and slightly rough to the touch. "You can play whatever piece you want," Ms. Blake said, leaning against the teacher's desk, arms crossed. "As long as you really can play." Malik didn't answer, but deep inside, a fire had started, not of anger, but of resolve. Behind him, a student muttered, "He'll probably hit a few notes and sit back down." Another replied, "That's okay, at least it'll be fun." He heard it all, but he also heard something else, something farther, deeper, the voice of his grandfather from a long-ago sunset. "Don't play to impress. Play like you're telling a piece of your heart." Malik closed his eyes. The piano in front of him was no longer just an object. It became a bridge between him and memory, between him and his truest self. One deep breath. Then he pressed the first key. The first note rang out soft and slow, as if Malik was testing whether the piano would actually listen. The initial sounds weren't perfect, a little offbeat, slightly out of tune because this old piano hadn't been cared for in years. From the back of the classroom, someone snickered quietly, but Malik didn't lift his head. He knew what he was about to do wasn't a reaction, wasn't to prove anything to anyone. It was to reconnect with something deeply personal that he thought he'd left behind. His fingers kept moving, slowly but with rhythm. The piece he chose wasn't some complex academic composition, it was a classic blues melody. The same tune his grandfather used to play every Saturday afternoon, in that sunlit kitchen where Malik used to sit and secretly watch his grandfather's fingers dance across the keys. At first, the class didn't quite understand what was happening. Brandon, the one who always saw himself as the center of attention, whispered to the student next to him, "Not bad, but probably just the intro." Tyler said nothing, but his eyes followed Malik's fingers closely, as if trying to understand how the quiet kid from the back of the room could play with such confidence under so many eyes. Then Malik moved into the second part where the melody began to transform. He added a touch of flair, a shift in tone. The sound grew deeper, more resonant. His left hand held the rhythm steady while the right began to soar across the higher notes, creating a surprising emotional harmony. No one said a word now. Ms. Blake, who had been standing with her arms crossed from the start, now let her shoulders drop slightly. Her eyes were locked on Malik, not with mockery, but with a complex expression: surprise, doubt, and a touch of unease. Malik still didn't look at anyone. He was in his own world. His movements over the piano keys grew more fluid, as if each finger was telling a story, recalling a memory, an inner silence he hadn't touched in a long time. The music reached its climax. The melody no longer sounded like the voice of a seventh-grade boy. It became the narrative of someone who had witnessed love and loss. A vast emotion filled the room, spreading like mist, soft, deep, and unbelievably real. Someone in the class gently tapped the shoulder of a friend as if to say, "Are you hearing this?" But no whisper was needed. Everyone was already listening, already feeling. Even Madison, the girl who never bothered to hide her indifference, had stopped writing. Her eyes quietly followed Malik's hands, as if hypnotized. And then, the ending. Malik gradually slowed down, each note drifting like the last breath of a quiet afternoon. He closed with a simple chord. Nothing flashy, nothing excessive, just a period at the end of a long, heartfelt sentence. The classroom was silent. There was no immediate applause, no gasps, just a long, heavy pause, as if everyone needed a moment to return to reality. Then from the middle row, Tyler clapped. Once, then twice. Madison joined in. Then the whole class, one by one, stood up and clapped. Not out of polite admiration, but because they had been pulled into something real and hard to name. Ms. Blake stood still. Malik looked up for the first time since he began. His gaze wasn't proud, wasn't defiant. It was simply calm, as if to say, "I've always been here. Today, you had to see me." And Ms. Blake, the teacher who thought this would be a light test, now stood face to face with something she never expected: the unmistakable presence of a student she had unconsciously pushed into the shadows. The final claps gradually faded, but the echo of the music still lingered in the air, like a scent that refused to disappear. The whole class sat in silence, eyes still fixed on the piano where Malik was seated, his hands resting gently on his lap, his gaze calm, not smug, not waiting for praise, just whole. Ms. Blake stood motionless at the front of the class, her arms still crossed, but clearly her shoulders were no longer as rigid. Her eyes flickered, not quite angry, not quite confused, but a blend of surprise and awkwardness. She was trying to recalibrate something inside herself, but couldn't quite find the way. Thank you, Malik," she said, her voice dry, unnatural, like she had just swallowed a stone. "You seem to have some talent." A few students glanced at each other. Tyler turned to Malik, lips pressed together to keep from laughing. Madison rested her chin on her hand, eyes sharp as she stared at Ms. Blake, as if to ask, "That's it?" Malik didn't respond. He simply gave a small nod, then walked slowly back to his seat. No bowing his head, no looking for approval, just a steady, upright walk, quiet, but sure. Ms. Blake flipped her lesson plan, clearly trying to bring the classroom back to normal. "Now," she said, her voice higher than usual, "we'll continue with today's exercise." But something had shifted. From the back row, Brandon muttered, "Weird. She was so eager to call him up, and now she's quiet like she lost her gradebook." Soft laughter rippled through the room, not loud, but enough to make the atmosphere strangely dense. Ms. Blake looked up, her eyes sharpening. "I don't find anything funny." Madison raised an eyebrow. "Not laughing, ma'am, just surprised. I think we all are." A simple comment, but it landed like a needle. "This is a classroom," Ms. Blake said, this time her tone more clipped. "Not a talent show." A brief silence. Then Tyler spoke up softly, but clearly. "The thing is, you never believed Malik had any talent at all." His words dropped into the room like a pebble into a still pond. No one spoke afterward. Ms. Blake stood frozen. Her face showed little or perhaps too much to show anything at all. Malik remained seated, but this time his gaze did not avoid hers. He looked straight at the board, not confrontationally, but as if to say, "You saw it now, didn't you?" There was nothing left to explain. Ms. Blake took a deep breath, turned back to the board, and wrote a few instructions for the next assignment. The chalk tapped sharply against the surface, an odd sound in a classroom that had just been immersed in music. "Please complete exercises 3 and 4, she said, her back still to the students. "I'll collect them at the end of the period." No one moved at first. A few opened their notebooks, but their eyes still drifted toward Malik. Not out of curiosity, but something new. A different kind of gaze. A shift. With a single piece of music, Malik had reclaimed his presence in a room where he had once been invisible, and Ms. Blake, despite her effort to maintain the cadence of a regular school day, knew deep down she had lost something, her unshakable faith in her own limited perspective. That afternoon, the sun cast slanted rays over the quiet rooftops of Maplewood. Malik pedaled slowly down the brick-paved street, the soft hiss of tires on pavement accompanying his thoughts, still drifting somewhere between the morning classroom and the music that hadn't quite faded from his heart. When he reached the white-painted wooden gate, he parked his bike by the porch, slipped the backpack off his shoulder, and stepped inside. The scent of ginger, sautéed shallots, and braised pork filled the air. Malik smiled. No matter what happened during the day, the smell of home-cooked food always grounded him. His mother stood by the stove, hair tied up high, stirring a pot of caramelized peppered fish. She turned her head when she heard the door open, her eyes lighting up, as they always did. "Home already, sweetheart? How was school today?" Malik set his bag down on a chair and hesitated slightly. "I have something to tell you." "All right," his mother said, turning off the stove and placing the pot on the table. "Tell me over dinner." They sat across from each other at a small wooden table with 2 bowls of rice, a plate of boiled greens, and a steaming bowl of soup. Malik picked up his spoon but didn't eat right away. He looked at his mother, his gaze not tense, just more serious than usual. "Ms. Blake had me play the piano in front of the whole class." His mother looked up, setting her chopsticks down. "She invited you?" "Not exactly," Malik exhaled softly. "She overheard me mentioning Grandpa and told me to perform." "And did you?" He nodded. His mother didn't speak right away. She just looked at him, then slowly smiled. "So, how did you feel?" Malik sighed, as if searching for the right words. "It's hard to explain, Mom. At first I thought she just wanted to embarrass me, but when I sat down and started to play, I suddenly wasn't scared anymore. I forgot the whole class. All that was left was the music." His mother nodded. "Just like when you were little, you'd freeze like a statue whenever Grandpa played the piano." Malik chuckled, a sound lighter than before. "The whole class was surprised. They didn't think I could play. Some even asked where I learned." "And what did you tell them?" "I said Grandpa taught me. You know, Mom, while I was playing, it felt like I was talking to him. Like I didn't need to explain anything, just let the music speak for me." His mother reached across the table and gently squeezed his hand. "Music is a part of you, Malik. It's how you connect to the world without using words. And today, you let everyone see that." Malik looked at her. "But I also realized something else." "What is it, sweetie?" "I realized I didn't need Ms. Blake's approval all this time. I just needed to believe in myself. And I think the class finally sees me differently now." His mother didn't say anything else. Her eyes shimmered under the kitchen light. She gently patted his hand, her voice warm. "That's real strength, Malik. Not making people afraid, but making them rethink how they see you." He nodded, feeling as if a small stone had just been lifted from his chest. "You know, Mom, I've never seen Ms. Blake that flustered before." His mother smiled faintly. "Maybe. You just taught her a lesson in the one thing she didn't expect." Malik lowered his head, scooped up a spoonful of rice. The rich scent of braised fish filled his nose, warming something deep inside him. That dinner wasn't long or fancy, but one thing was certain. Malik was no longer invisible in the eyes of others. The next morning, when Malik walked into literature class at Jefferson Grove School, everything looked the same: desks in neat rows, sunlight spilling through the windows onto the chalkboard, and the usual soft murmurs. But he could clearly feel one thing: the atmosphere had changed. The way his classmates looked at him wasn't like the day before, no longer indifferent or curious. Instead, there was a kind of respect. "Yo, Malik," Tyler whispered as Malik set his backpack down. "You totally stunned the class yesterday." Malik smiled lightly. "I just played music." Tyler shook his head. "Not just. You left Ms. Blake speechless." Malik sat down, his eyes still drifting toward the piano in the corner of the room. He didn't regret anything. Despite the nervousness beforehand, that moment had shifted something not only inside him, but within the whole classroom. When Ms. Blake's heels clicked in from the hallway, the class fell silent by reflex. She walked in, tidy as usual, but her eyes briefly scanned past Malik quicker than usual, as if avoiding something uncomfortable. No one said anything, but everyone noticed. The lesson began with an analysis of To Kill a Mockingbird, a familiar topic. But this time, when she asked, Who can explain why the character Atticus Finch is considered a symbol of justice? Malik raised his hand. She looked at him. A flicker of hesitation crossed her face, so brief, yet noticeable. Then she nodded. Malik. Because Atticus didn't just talk about justice, Malik replied calmly. He lived it. Even when others doubted him, he stood firm because he believed the truth carries its own weight. A soft sounded from the back of the class. Ms. Blake didn't respond right away. She simply nodded and moved on to the next student. But to Malik, that was enough. The class was witnessing something new. A teacher who once seemed unshakable now occasionally paused mid-sentence, as if cautious around someone. "She's different now," Madison whispered while the class worked in groups. "Probably embarrassed for how she treated Malik," Brandon added, his tone subtle but loaded. Malik remained silent. He didn't gloat. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His silence that day was the loudest sound in the room. During recess, as Malik stepped into the hallway, a few students from other classes nodded as they passed. Some smiled. Others looked at him with a newfound curiosity, not because he was strange, but because they admired him. He sat on a stone bench in the courtyard and opened the lunchbox his mom had packed. Amid the cheerful chatter, Malik felt a strange kind of peace. He didn't need to stand out. He didn't need to argue. He just needed to be seen clearly and listened to with sincerity. When Tyler came and sat beside him, he asked, "Are you going to play again?" Malik nodded, eyes still on the schoolyard. "Yeah, but not to prove anything, just because I enjoy it," Tyler grinned. "That's right, keep that feeling." And somewhere behind them, Ms. Blake passed by in the hallway, catching a glimpse of the two boys talking. This time, her gaze wasn't cold nor confused, just quiet, as if she was learning how to see a student without prejudice. That day, no one shouted. No one said anything too loud. But Malik knew, from now on, he would no longer be seen as a shadow. That evening, as the warm yellow light in her small apartment illuminated the scattered lesson plans, Ms. Blake couldn't focus. The bold title on her outline, "Preparing to Teach Modern Poetry," kept blurring before her eyes. She sighed, closed everything, and leaned back in her chair. In her mind, images from today's class kept looping. Malik, the quiet student she had almost never paid attention to, was now the name that had changed the entire atmosphere of the classroom. Not because he was disruptive or showy, but because he stood up once and played the piano. But what disturbed her more was the look in the eyes of the other students, Tyler, Madison, Brandon. There was something in the way they looked at her, as if they had started to realize something that she herself was still denying. She had never thought of herself as biased. She had always told herself she was fair, equally strict with all her students. But then she remembered. How many times had Malik raised his hand and she didn't call on him? How many times had he given a correct answer and she just nodded and moved on? She used to tell herself, "He's not remarkable, nothing stands out about him." Now that very unremarkable quality was what made her uneasy. The next morning, walking into class, she felt her students' eyes brushing against her like an invisible cloak, a cloak named doubt. No one said anything, but she could feel it. The classroom no longer completely belonged to her. When she started the lesson, she called on a student in the front row to answer, but the boy stammered. She felt herself wanting to push him like she usually did, but then she paused, lowered her voice, and calmly rephrased the question. The class fell silent. Midway through the period, a student timidly raised their hand. "Miss, I think this poem is kind of like how Malik played the piano yesterday. At first, it sounds simple, but the more you listen, the more it feels really real." Her heart skipped. A small tightness rose in her throat. She nodded. "That's a very good observation." It was the first time in years of teaching that she truly didn't know what else to say. During recess, as she stood in the teacher's lounge, she overheard some murmurs among colleagues. A young teacher said, "Something's different in Class 7C these days. I heard a student played the piano so well the whole class applauded like crazy." Another teacher joked, "And Ms. Blake just stood there like a statue." She forced a smile, but inside, every word tapped gently on the pride shell she had grown so used to wearing. At that moment, she realized something quietly. It wasn't her students who were changing. It was her, or at least the image of her in their eyes, that had changed. And maybe that change should have happened a long time ago. At the end of the school day, when Malik stayed back for a moment to turn in a makeup assignment, she handed him back his last quiz this time, with a handwritten comment for the first time. "Deep analysis, tight argument, well done." He looked up at her, his gaze not cold, not heavy, just calm. "Thank you, miss," Malik said softly. She nodded. "Malik, would you consider playing that piece again at next week's special assembly? Maybe share it with the whole grade?" Malik raised an eyebrow slightly, but didn't ask why. "I'll think about it," he replied, then walked out of the room. She watched him go, and for the first time, understood that she no longer stood at the front of the classroom to teach something to her students. She was now learning how to be a real teacher again. The school week passed in a changed atmosphere. Ever since Malik's first piano performance, the classroom had quietly shifted, not with excitement or dramatic transformation, but with a subtle stillness, much like the way Malik always walked, slowly yet steadily. Ms. Blake spoke less, not because she had lost authority, but because she was observing. Her lectures were no longer monologues, students became more active. Names she had never called on before now offered opinions, and surprisingly, she listened. She began calling on Malik regularly, not cautiously, not confrontationally, just simply, as if trying to mend something she had once carelessly broken. And then came the special class. It was a sunny Friday morning. Light filtered through the classroom windows, casting long lines across the floor where the old piano now sat freshly cleaned and gleaming. Ms. Blake announced briefly, "Today we'll conclude our unit on personal expression in art with a short performance. Malik has agreed to share a piece he enjoys with the class." Her hands were slightly stiff as she spoke, but her voice had softened. No sharpness, no edge of defensiveness. Malik walked to the front amidst the usual murmurs. But this time, no one laughed. No one awaited failure. The entire class seemed ready to be led into something beautiful. He sat down and gave Ms. Blake a slight nod, not resentful, not defiant, just a polite, measured greeting. Malik placed his hands on the keys. This time, he didn't choose a blues piece like before. He began with a soft prelude of classical influence, then transitioned smoothly into jazz. The blend felt like a bridge between two worlds, between tradition and individuality, between what had been overlooked and what was now being heard. The class was completely silent. Tyler sat upright, eyes wide. Madison wasn't taking notes. She simply rested her chin in her hand and watched. Brandon, the once sarcastic classmate, leaned back in his chair, eyes following every movement of Malik's fingers. And then, Malik stopped, one beat after the final chord. He didn't bow. He didn't seek acknowledgement. He simply looked out at the class, not arrogant, not meek, just someone who knew he had done the right thing. Applause followed, not loud, but steady. One by one, then all at once. Ms. Blake didn't clap, but the look in her eyes had changed. She no longer looked down from above. She looked as someone who knew she had just witnessed something meaningful. After class, when most students had left, Ms. Blake called Malik over, not with authority, not as a command, just a quiet invitation. "Malik," she said, standing beside the piano, "do you know why I love literature?" Malik furrowed his brow slightly. "Because it says the things we can't usually say?" She laughed softly, genuinely this time. "That's right. And today, you showed me that. Not with words, but with music." Malik nodded. He didn't add anything more. As he was about to leave, he turned back and asked, "Do you think music can be an essay too?" She looked at him for a long moment. Then, for the first time all school year, she said, "Perhaps it's the essay I've overlooked." That day, Malik went home in silence. But inside, a melody was still playing. Not because he was applauded, not because he had proven anything, but because he had been seen, heard, understood. And for a 7th grade boy, that could change the way he walked through the world ahead. Malik didn't speak much. He never tried to seek attention. But in the exact moment it mattered most, he let the music speak for him. And that changed everything. The teacher once thought he was just a quiet shadow in the classroom. But after that day, she could never look at Malik the same way again. Just like the classmates who used to mock him, now silently admired him. Perhaps, in this life, not everyone needs to shout to be heard. Sometimes, all it takes is one timely moment, one sincere action, to let the world truly see who you are. And if you've ever been a Malik, or met a Malik in your life, remember this. Strength doesn't lie in the loudest voice, but in the quietest truth you carry with you. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue telling more stories just as deep and inspiring. And if you have a similar story, leave a comment below because who knows, you might just be the next voice to inspire millions who are listening.